Okay now, Joe. You are to think back now. Think back to when you were 12 years old. Do you remember when you were 12? She coaxed Joe. Joe sleepily replied, Yes, I remember being 12. It was 10 years ago. Helena grinned and said, That's great, Joe. You are now to remember the first time you went by yourself very far from home. Now, tell me all about what you are experiencing right now in that moment. Joe said, I'm 12. I'm driving fast down the Villa Green Road in my dead daddy's 1918 Model T. That was in 1935 when you did that, I believe, wasn't it? Helena asked. Yes, it was 1935, he replied. Who taught you to drive, Joe? Your mother? Helena asked. I taught myself to drive by watching my older brothers. I nearly wrecked it a few times. Had an old SOB run me off the road one time. That old Dudley hook load. I had to fix a flat in the hot sun in the middle of July. I was barely big enough to do it. Helena took a couple of breaths and carefully focused on Joe's face. She said, What did they do to you when you were in the Navy, Joe? The Navy drained the life out of me. The ocean, the war, the $1 a day herding sheep in the canyons. I learned a few things, being a radio operator. I keep my lips zipped. Loose lips sink ships. That's enough for now, Joe. Now, I want you to come back to our meditation. Come back to me and hear my breaths again. Listen to the sound of my breathing and match your breathing to mine. Now, when I count down to 1, you will open your eyes and feel completely refreshed. 3, 2, 1. Joe opened his eyes and looked over at Helena. Is that it? Seems like a few seconds of napping to me. Sorry, Helena, but I don't think meditation is for me. Helena smiled thinly and replied, Think not? Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Joe. Until we meet again, try not to worry about any of it. Come see me again next Sunday. And, Joe, try to stop drinking so much, could you? Chapter 2. Survival on Many Fronts. For months after that, he always came up with some excuse to not be available for Helena on Sundays. He stopped going to dances and hanging out with the other cowboys. More and more, he grumbled to himself through the long work days and kept to himself, drinking at night and drinking more on weekends. Day followed day, season followed season. Typically, hot, dry summers and cold, blowing blizzard winters were punctuated briefly by a muddy spring and a shorter, stormy fall. Through it all, Joe trudged solitarily and withdrawn. Whiskey became his only friend. Former friends got married, built families, became owners of thriving ranches, and generally lived full lives of the rural class. Joe carefully avoided them whenever possible. Life kept on lifing for them. Not so for Joe. One morning he woke up in Chippewa Canyon near the ring of stones that had contained his small cooking fire the night before. Unlike the other cowhands, Joe always made as small a fire as he possibly could, just big enough to cook in a small pan. The large bonfires most cowboys made he called white man's fire. He always said he preferred red man's fire. Chili con frijoles had been supper. He felt sticky. He looked down to his arms. Muddy puke coated his chest and arms like a bad-smelling pinto bean ice cream topping. The empty Jim Beam bottle he still clutched in his left hand. His loaded and cocked, long-barreled revolver next to his right hand. He jumped to his feet and stumbled back from the gun. It lay in the dirt, fully cocked and ready to shoot, speckled with vomit and pointing towards where he'd been laying. "What in the hell is wrong with me?" he yelled at it. The thought of what he'd almost done in a drunken stupor made him thirsty for more whiskey. Mostly, it made up his mind about handguns. He found Steve Roseberg in his shop, leaning all the way over the top of a tractor's diesel engine. "Hey, you old son of a bitch, what are you up to?" Joe called to his best friend. Not that they hung around much together these days. Steve stopped working his ratchet wrench and climbed down off the tractor. "Well, Joe, what are you doing here, you filthy bastard?" he shouted with a huge grin looming over Joe from his 6'4" lanky frame. They shook hands warmly. Joe reached into the cab of the pickup and grabbed his coiled belt holster and long-barreled pistol. "I've got something for you. Call it an early birthday present." He handed the leather-clad weapon to Steve. Steve raised his eyebrows and said, "Why in the world would you give me your pistol, Joe? I know you love this thing. Why, you're a crack shot with it. You know I can barely hit the broadside of a barn with a pistol. Why are you giving me your favorite sidearm?" "I just don't need it anymore is all." "You can use it to shoot rattlesnakes. Besides, you need as much practice with a pistol as you can get." Joe tried to sound light-hearted about his strange gift-giving, but it came out strained and odd-sounding. Steve stood with Joe's holstered pistol sitting in his large, outstretched hand. He looked down hard at Joe, perplexed. "Well, I gotta go. I'll see you later, Steve. Try not to shoot yourself with that pistol, eh?" Joe said matter-of-factly as he climbed back into his pickup. Without another word, he drove off. The next Saturday night, Joe rode into the canyon alone, with 3 bottles of Jim Beam in his saddlebag. It was a hot, dry summer day with barely a breeze. The wind on the high plains rarely stops completely, but today it was almost still. He brought no food. He tied his horse up near a stand of piñon trees that formed a little natural circle clearing. After kicking some sandstone rocks together into a rough circle, he leaned back against a tree trunk, pulled out his little canvas bag of Bull Durham tobacco, and rolled a cigarette. He lit it and smoked a bit, picked up one of the 3 bottles of whiskey, opened it, and glugged down a big cow swallow, enjoying the harsh sting of the drink on his smoky, dry throat. Staring into the distance, he could just make out a turkey buzzard, circling high above the creek that began the Purgatory River, which snaked its way through the bottom of the canyon, about 50 yards from his camp spot. It was little more than a trickle in summer. "Probably another dying calf somewhere over there, damn it! Can't keep 'em all alive no matter how hard we try," he thought to himself. "Take another drink and forget about it," he commanded himself. Sitting next to his little campfire, he swigged whiskey, smoked, and complained of his loneliness. The more he drank, the more he complained, and the more incoherent each cussing moment became. In the middle of the night, by the glow of the dying fire, he spun around in a plastered rage. He punched the trees, pounded on the ground, and yelled oaths and threats into the dark. At one point he untied his horse, slapped it hard on the rump, and screamed, "Get out of here, Banjo, you wall-eyed son of a wish! Who cares what you think?" The horse loped off in fear. Propped up against a tree, he blearily eyed the half-empty 3rd bottle. He tried to lift it to his lips, but passed out with it halfway to his mouth, and dropped it instead. He woke up very slowly. He felt like a log that long ages ago had become waterlogged. He was just an old log, bobbing down the surface of a vast, endless sea. The effort it took to barely open one eye surprised him. He did not recognize the place. All white and pastel green. Strange colors for this canyon, he thought. With great effort he opened the other eye. He saw a cute young woman in white. It seemed to him that she had some pie meringue in her hair. Or was that a hat? "Hey, where am I?" he barely managed to grunt out. The nurse turned to Joe and leaned over him. She looked into his eyes and then said,
"Wait, I'll go get the doctor. He wants to talk to you."
Her transformation into an older, balding man seemed magical.
"Mr. Gandy, can you see me? Can you hear me?"
The doctor asked as he shined a tiny flashlight into Joe's eyes. It took a few seconds before Joe remembered how to speak again. "Sure, I can see and hear. Who are you? Where am I?"
"I'm Dr. Pavel, and you are in the Arkansas Valley Hospital."
"What happened? Did I get shot?"
"No. You were found in a canyon on the prairie, sunburned, dehydrated, and out cold. You have been in a coma for at least a day," the doctor said with a bit of consternation in his voice. "It's Sunday. I gotta go learn something from Helena." Joe's voice sounded distant and then trailed off completely. The doctor shook Joe slightly to be sure he was still awake. "No, it is not Sunday. Today is Monday, and it is in the middle of the afternoon. Evidently, young man, you drank yourself into a coma. You are clearly one of those men who can't drink. You are basically allergic to alcohol. I strongly recommend that you give up drinking."
It took a while for Joe to take this in. Then he stared back at the doctor in shock. The doctor kept him in the hospital for another day, and then sent him home. He returned to the ranch and sulked in the bunkhouse. When the other ranch hands and the owner asked him what had happened, Joe sheepishly told them, "I guess I got food poisoning." When he told this fib to Helena, she did not miss a beat.
"Food poisoning? My ass! You poisoned yourself all right, with whiskey. You keep this up and you'll find yourself with cirrhosis of the liver. It will kill you eventually, just like Carl James, who drank himself to death, leaving his poor widow and little Henry to fend for themselves. But this coma business will probably get you first. At least stop drinking so much at a time."
Joe did stop drinking, at least for a few weeks. Then a couple of the other hands invited him to a barn dance, and he went. They brought him back to the bunkhouse, drunk as a skunk. He returned to drinking at least a fifth of whiskey every Saturday, after long weeks of hard riding, roping, fence building, and well digging. The ranch owners bought an expensive new television and a very large antenna array. The black and white tube TV set was mounted in a long credenza. It was a major piece of furniture that also housed a phonograph player and an AM radio. The whole setup weighed over 100 pounds, containing many large glass vacuum tubes and cloth-insulated wiring. It took a few minutes after turning it on for the 9-inch black and white screen to start displaying a low-contrast, flickering gray image. It could receive on 3 channels. They used most of a Sunday to set up the 12-foot by 18-foot antenna up high on a 20-foot tall steel water pipe mast, which Joe and Mr. Groden set deep into the ground. The antenna was the biggest model sold by Sears and Roebuck, quite necessary to receive TV signals so far from the nearest transmitter tower about 60 miles away. Joe became instantly addicted to TV. He came to the ranch dinner every night and worked on buttering up Helena to make sure he was invited to Sunday dinner as often as possible. He spent most of his time during these visits in their living room, his eyes glued to the magic screen. He became a fan of Jackie Gleason, Red Skelton, and Groucho Marx. All the cowboys gossiped and retold jokes from their new experiences of television. Joe stayed on the ranch on the weekends and watched TV. He found it helped him avoid drinking.